Hello, good people of the internet. Allow me to introduce you to Sergeant Walter the Cat. What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and I have a little bit of bad news because it seems that Harold the Cat was just some guild propaganda to try to give us all warm fuzzies and make us all think a little more positively about them. But the good news is that we're also here to talk about Harold Tull, and I'm going to be showing off his card, as well as a couple cards from his crew. So huge shout out to Weird for sending over that information for me to share with all of you. And keep in mind that while they sent the assets and the cards, everything I say here is my opinion, and not Weird's. But before we get to the crunchy bits, we're going to take a minute to go over what the King's Empire is, and how Harold Tull fits into the story. I mean, this is the lore channel after all, right? Between the time of the two breach openings, the guild spread its power and influence around the globe, leveraging its dominance of the soulstone trade to bend the nations of the world to its will. But their dominance couldn't last forever, and after signs of weakness started showing, the King's Empire was one of the first nations to distance itself from the guild. Having spent a great deal of time and effort improving its industrial and economic power, as well as working on its relationship with its colonies, the Empire noticed that the guild was spread thin, focusing much of its attention and resources in Malifaux, and once they finally had enough soulstones, they declared independence from the guild in 1904. This prompts the guild to move its headquarters from London to Vienna, and sets a precedent for other nations to start opposing guild dominance. All of this, of course, angers the powerful organization, but with their hands full in other places, the most they do in retaliation is impose some trade embargoes on the King's Empire. By leveraging their ties to the colonies they've maintained since before the Black Powder Wars, as well as their connection to the Arcanists, which supplied black market soulstones, the Empire was able to flourish without the guild, and tensions continued to rise, almost leading to war. But then, the Burning Man arrived. After wreaking havoc elsewhere, the Burning Man eventually made its way to London, and heralded an invasion from the gibbering hordes, aquatic creatures from the oceans of Malifaux. They laid siege to the city in what would become known as the Battle of London, flooding the streets with both water and creatures, and killing civilians and soldiers alike. Months after the battle, the Empire was still trying to root out more of the creatures that were living in the dark corners. Between the invading gibbering hordes and the cultists that began cropping up all around the world and worshipping the Burning Man, the guild and the King's Empire, as well as the other nations of the world, had way too much on their plates to continue bickering with each other. Later, when the Burning Man appeared in Malifaux, bringing with it a wave of chaos and destruction, Governor-General Marlowe put out a call Earthside to send assistance. The King's Empire were one of the first to respond. Harold Tull was born in the King's Empire, and his knack for artillery allowed him to advance in the military as a gunner. He soon earned a reputation for being cavalier, using unconventional tactics and sometimes going directly against orders, but his results always spoke for themselves. When his superiors couldn't decide whether to court-martial him or continue to let him loose on their enemies, they found a solution in an unusual place. The guild, wanting to improve their relationship with the King's Empire, offered to station Tull in front of their headquarters in Vienna, and promised to take responsibility for any damage he would cause. His predilection for experimental weapons and non-traditional tactics made him the obvious choice to send to Malifaux to help defend against the Burning Man. But guns can't solve all problems, and Tull and his company are also well known for their infiltration techniques, using smoke as cover and silenced guns to overcome their enemies with stealth. He even uses his deafness as an asset, coordinating his men on these infiltration missions, using an intricate system of hand gestures and signals. Well, it seems we have our answer as to what the Cavalier keyword actually means. So without further ado, let's check out Tull's card. This crew seems like it's going to have an interesting combination of indirect damage, some movement shenanigans, and good action economy. So to start, let's take a look at Rain Hellfire. This ability allows you to drop a number of assault markers on the board equal to the turn number, within 18 inches. The assault markers don't have any inherent effect, but they do help activate an ability called Heat of Battle, which is something that's pretty common in his crew and we'll get to in a little bit. The main thing that Tull is concerned with, as far as the assault markers go, is for his bombardment ability, which says that once everyone has activated, every enemy model within 2 of an assault marker has to take a move 12 duel or suffer 2 damage ignoring armor. And the target number goes up by 1 for every friendly walking cannon in play. Now those are Tull's totems, and he's going to start the game with 2 of them, so this is actually going to be a TN14 move duel, at least at first. Now the interesting thing about the timing here is that you'll have to be pretty good about planning the position for your assault markers to get the best effect out of them. But because your opponent will be taking these tests after every model has activated, it means that it's very likely they'll have few cards in their hand, and they'll just be relying on flipping cards off the deck. If you can hit 4 or 5 of the enemy models with the ability, then even if they have pretty high stats, you're still likely to hit a good chunk of them. On the other hand, if they flip a bunch of high cards, they were about to shuffle their deck anyway, so you don't really get a lot of the benefit out of that. He's also got another interesting ability, Get to Position, where when he activates, 2 friendly Cavalier models get to move up to 3 inches. Hard to Kill is a pretty well-known ability, but he also has Gunfighter, also a well-known ability, but take note of it, because you're going to notice that a lot of the abilities in this crew seem to mirror some of the abilities that the King's Empire has in the other side. If you caught the Danger Planets video a few weeks ago, where they did an awesome breakdown of the Angler crew, you may have noticed that that crew also has a lot of similarities to the Gibbering Hordes in the other side. And while we're at it, don't forget to check out Malifaux University, who did the reveal for Castor, and Corner Case, who showed us the rules for the story keyword. But back to Tull. On the back of his card, we have a quick action called Artillery Strike, where you flip a 4 and generate another assault marker. That should make your bombardment at the end of the turn even more devastating, and is going to synergize with some of the other abilities in the crew that we haven't seen yet. It has a non-built-in trigger to do marker removal, which is always super handy, and a built-in trigger that lets one of his totems take an action. His first attack action is called the MFGL. Now, another big thing in the King's Empire is the use of grenade launchers, and we can see from the art that Tull seems to be a fan. So we could speculate that the GL stands for grenade launcher. But what about the MF? I'm thinking that this is a BFG situation here, but I'll let everybody else decide for themselves what that stands for. But anyway, the attack is a 10-inch projectile, accuracy 6, and ignores Cavalier models for friendly fire. 246 damage, but interestingly, it automatically does a 2-inch pulse off the target to ping 1 damage onto other enemy models. More indirect damage. It's got a trigger to give focus, and another trigger that does an additional point of damage to the target and enemy models within 2, if the target's within 2 inches of an assault marker. Pretty handy. Heavy Salvo is a 10-inch gun that targets move, and pushes an enemy model 6 inches away, ignoring terrain, and causes 2 damage and staggered. This seems like a great way to keep enemy models away from your gun line, but conveniently it's also going to cause damage. And then we have a trigger, good for a laugh, to draw 2 cards and discard 1. And his last attack action, you have your target, is a 7 against willpower, and it gives out Adversary, which is always a handy condition to put on your enemies. But in addition, it has 2 triggers, 1 to end a condition on the target, and 1 to potentially move around some of the enemy models. This could be super helpful to get more value out of the bombardment ability at the end of the turn. As for playing Tull, I think he's going to primarily focus on taking down groups of enemies. He's got a pretty high health count at 13, plus hard to kill, so I think you'll want to play him somewhat aggressively, and focus on shooting at groups of enemies to use that pulse damage to take down a bunch of weaker models. Then of course he'll use Artillery Strike to spread out the threat from bombardment to either deny areas of the board, or potentially put out even more damage. So speaking of his totem, next up we have the Walking Cannon. As I said, you're going to start with 2 of these on the board. It's got low stats, low health, but armor 2. Which means depending on your opponent's crew, they may or may not be pretty vulnerable. They also have this ability Resupply, where when the model activates, you get to draw any non-joker from your discard pile that's a 5 or lower. You might be wondering why that would be useful. We still haven't seen the Heat of Battle ability that's referenced on Tull's card, but it's going to require you to discard a card, so it'll be convenient to have an extra week in your hand so you're not pitching any good resources. On the back of the card we have Howitzer, and here's where we'll start to see some similarities to the artillery team that you can run in the King's Empire for the other side. This is an accuracy 4 attack, but it's got an 18-inch range, and it ignores line of sight. The target's within 2 inches of a friendly scheme marker or assault marker. It does 1, 2, 3 damage with a blast on each of them, so you're probably not going to be killing anybody with this early in the game, but you can do some chip damage to a group, and with the targeted strike trigger, you can potentially pick up some of your opponent's scheme markers. Always Ready with T is an excellent tactical action, where you can remove a condition from a friendly model, and if it's within keyword, you can also heal for 2. And finally, Recalibrating, which is also an 18-inch range that doesn't require line of sight and lets you reposition some assault markers or scheme markers. Now keep in mind that at the beginning of the game, you're going to have 2 of these guys running around, and they're really going to help you make the best of the assault markers you get from Rain Hellfire. The Walking Cannons seem like fun little totems. Your opponent will definitely be able to take them out if they really want to, but with an 18-inch gun, it shouldn't be too hard to keep these guys protected. I don't think they're going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, but they'll definitely be a nuisance for anything that your opponent wants to protect, and the addition of condition removal and healing means they'll probably always have something to do. Next up, let's take a look at the Sapper. These are the pretty mask boys that we saw in the trailer for Madness of Malifaux a few weeks ago. And here we get our first glimpse at Heat of Battle. At the end of the model's activation, if it's within 2 inches of a scheme marker, or an assault marker, as a result of Tull's Rain Hellfire ability, then it can discard a card to take a non-quick action. As I mentioned, this is why having a couple of weak cards in your hand are going to help you out, because you can pitch them to take an extra shot or drop another scheme marker. They have Gunfighter, Duck and Cover, which makes them resist a lot of indirect damage, Stealth, and a built-in defense trigger, where they get to push 5 inches away from an enemy after resolving the duel. All this together should make them pretty slippery, because unless you're in melee, that defense trigger will likely be able to get you outside of stealth range, so your enemy won't get a follow-up attack. On the back of their card, they have a Trench Gun attack, which is a close-range projectile that ignores friendly fire, and does 2 3 blast damage. Now that's kind of underwhelming, but they are 5-stone models, so bear that in mind. Disrupt Supply Line is a 3 with a positive twist against willpower, and makes your opponent discard a random card. It'll be kind of hard to get this off, but if you do, making your opponent discard a random card is pretty good. And it has a trigger to drop a scheme marker. Finally, they have a tactical action, Exploit Weakness, which needs a 5 and lets you look at the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck and put them back in any order. This could be a good way to guarantee an action goes off, and it also has a built-in trigger that lets you pick up a low card that you can then use for Heat of Battle. The Sappers are pretty interesting. They have an okay attack, but I think their primary role is going to be as a scheme runner. If you set things up correctly, they can actually interact, then walk,
and use Heat of Battle to interact again and drop 2 scheme markers. When you combine that with Stealth and their defense trigger, your opponent will have to invest a lot of resources into taking them out.
And now last for the new stuff, you've heard of the King's Hand, well now meet the King's Wall. This is the henchman for Tull's crew, and he's going to be all about tanking and protecting your friendly models. We have Heat of Battle like we saw on the Sapper, which will potentially get you another action at the end of your activation. Laugh Off and Armor 1, which we're all familiar with, and will make this guy harder to kill and harder to ignore. But then we have Demise Broken Armor. After this model is killed, it's replaced with a Sapper that heals 2 and gains slow. I guess the idea is there's a Sapper inside the suit, and once you get through all the armor, he jumps out with a shotgun and keeps up the fight. I think that's pretty cool. For King and Country is also a really cool ability that imposes a negative twist to any attack actions, duels, and damage flips that target Cavalier models within 2 of this model. I guess the idea here is that he's creating a shield wall to protect all of his allies. And finally we have Symbol of the Realm, which makes the King's Wall activate the Heat of Battle ability, but also allows friendly Cavalier models to ignore any negative twists to their attacks when targeting a model that this model is engaging. If you thought all the indirect damage was not enough, this can be another great way to get around things like Serene Countenance or Manipulative. On the back of the card we have Enhanced Fists, a 1-inch 6 accuracy melee that does 246 damage. It has a trigger to give this model shielded, and another trigger that lets a friendly keyword model take a projectile action against the target. Shield Slam we've seen before. It's a point of damage and a 2-inch push, but this one has a built-in trigger called Daze, where the target gets stunned and pushes another 3 inches. Bulldoze is an ability that you might recognize from Neil Henry, where the model gets to push its move and turn any markers it moved through into scrap markers. If you overlap an enemy model, they have to take a target 13 move duel or take 2 damage and staggered. It also has a trigger that lets friendly models move through impassable terrain that this model moved through while using the ability. And finally, he's got the quick action I've got your back, with a trigger to give him a point of shielded.
This ability is usually a great way to get a model out of the fray, and somewhere safer, but it's especially good on the King's Wall, because that model is going to end up within its For King and Country aura, where it gets even more protection. The King's Wall is a really cool looking model, and I think it's going to do a great job of protecting your gun line, though your opponent's probably going to focus on it pretty hard. He can also do a decent amount of damage, and the ability to give out stun pretty consistently can be really useful in the right situation. Bulldoze is a really great ability, and while so far this crew doesn't have any use for scrap markers, it can be a real nuisance for any crew that relies heavily on markers like Titania.
So that's it for the new stuff, but just to round everything out, let's take another look at the Hexbow, which is a model that we had known the rules for a few weeks now. Tull has to share these guys with Sonya Crid, but for now let's forgive them and take a look at their abilities. We once again see Heat of Battle, which we now know is one of the common abilities through much of this crew, and they have a lot of different ways to support using this ability more effectively. Rune Quiver will allow this model to get a guaranteed trigger, unless your opponent discards a card, which can be useful, because the Hexbows have a ton of triggers available to them. On the back of the card we see the Blessed Longbow, a 12-inch projectile that ignores concealment and does 2-3-4 damage ignoring incorporeal. It's got a built-in blaze trigger, which you can potentially bump up to 2 burning with the Rune Quiver ability. The King's Glory, which lets another model shoot at the target. Puncture, which is a positive twist to damage. And Cleansing Strike, which is another example of offensive condition removal. Target Practice lets you snipe scheme markers off the board, but the Screaming Arrow trigger lets you generate some target number 14 willpower duels to potentially do 2 damage to any targets who fail. And last we have Fistful of Arrows, which we've seen before on the Thunder Archers, that lets you get blast damage on your projectile attacks. But this one has a reposition trigger to let the model move up to 3 inches. That could be a convenient way to get yourself out of engagement, if you happen to have a 7 of masks in your hand.
So, if everything goes according to plan, you can use Fistful of Arrows to add blast to your attack, and then attack a target doing 2-3-4 damage, ignoring incorporeal. Blast the damage onto another target, and declare the Blaze trigger to give everyone hurt by the attack, burning 1 or maybe 2, and then make a follow-up shot to do it all over again. That could potentially be a lot of damage on any crew that likes to bunch up a lot. I think this combo is why the Hexbows are going to put out a lot more damage than it first seems just looking at their card.
So that's everything that we know so far for the Cavalier crew. I'm pretty excited about these guys.
They look really interesting so far. It seems like they have a good combination of offense and defense, as well as some anti-scheme running, and it seems like they can fight from a variety of ranges. That kind of makes me worried that they'll be a jack of all trades, master of none type situation. But one thing they certainly do seem to excel at is indirect damage. Lots of blasts, auras, pulses, and stuff like that. So while it's possible it'll turn out that the crew doesn't have a great niche that they excel at, I think they'll be a real menace against crews that rely on defensive tech, like Serene Countenance, and Intimidating Authority, or models that just rely on high stats, or things like defensive triggers.
I think it's really cool how Weird's done a great job of making the mechanics feel similar to a lot of the stuff we've seen in the other side. For example, in the other side, the King's Empire has a big emphasis on guns, which we can obviously see here, but even more specifically, being able to use artillery bombardments, long-range inaccurate fire, and the ability to use your guns as a melee attack are all things we see in the King's Empire and in Tull's crew. In addition, a big theme for the guild in the other side is the ability to take extra shots out of activation and get extra actions which is something we also see with some of the triggers in Tull's crew, as well as the heat of battle ability. I'm really excited to see more crossover between Malifaux and the other side, and I hope we see even more models coming up that are going to work between both games. So drop a comment and let me know what you think. Are you excited to play Harold Tull in the game? Are you excited to learn more about his lore and his backstory? I definitely want to see some of the other stuff that's going to come to this crew, like this cheerful lady, and Dr. Watson and his pup, as well as Tull's title version, Dead Silent, because it seems like he's going to play a lot differently than Harold Tull the Artillerist. You may have also noticed that Tull is just in the guild for Malifaux, and if you're following along with all these reveals, you probably know that that means by process of elimination, Tiri has to be in the Explorer Society and the Outcasts. I'm definitely excited to learn more about her, and if you are too, don't forget to tune in to TNG Productions next week, because they're going to be doing the last spoiler here, talking about Tiri and her crew. Like, we don't even know what her keyword is yet. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe, head over to the Discord, because we're always talking about this stuff, trying to predict future releases, and getting into the nitty-gritty of the backstory. So if that sounds fun, definitely hop over there. And if you really like what I'm doing, then you can check out the Patreon, also linked in the description, where you can send over a couple bucks to support the channel, and get a bunch of cool perks. And with that, thanks for watching.